So we're talking about getting rid of entire segments of the population. And the most charitable interpretation of this is we are going to pass laws and create societal conditions where an entire group of people choose to either leave, flee, seek asylum, detransition, or go underground, right?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to What the Gerrymander, brought to you by Who's Your Victory Alliance, an organization I co-founded. This podcast is our attempt to raise the alarm about the war MAGA Republicans are waging against Americans in Indiana and across the country. MAGA is implementing a strategy of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and cruel legislation to take away our freedom and increase their power. MAGA is using fascist tactics, corruption, conspiracy theories, and disinformation to make themselves and their billionaire funders richer and more powerful. They target the most vulnerable among us, but make no mistake, we and our children are targets too, whatever our gender, color, sexual orientation, or location. Across the country, the fascist MAGA party is forcing transgender kids and adults to detransition, greatly increasing their risk of suicide. MAGA is pushing gun ownership for white Christians as part of their war and pretending to believe more guns make America safer. We know this is a vile lie, and our children are paying the price with their lives. And MAGA has systematically stripped bodily autonomy for women, first in red states and potentially nationwide. MAGA is banning books, and if they can't ban books, they're closing libraries, defunding public education, and outlawing the teaching of the real history of America. All this is connected, and it is a war against you and me and all Americans who want to live in a pluralistic democracy. Today's guest is Brynn Tannehill, who is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and the Air Force Institute of Technology with degrees in computer science and operations research. She is a naval aviator who did 4 deployments to locations such as the Adriatic, Middle East, and the North Atlantic. After leaving active duty, she has continued to work in defense research, while as an advocate writer and researcher on LGBTQ civil rights issues and policy. She currently works at a think tank in the Washington, D.C. area as a senior analyst where she lives with her wife and 3 children. My conversation with Brynn is the darkest conversation you'll hear in this series. She believes that we are not in a good space, and really only Gen Z has the power to pull us out. Please take a listen. I'd really love to know what you think. Hello, Brynn, and welcome to What the Gerrymander podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I'm so glad you're here. I came to know your work on Twitter, where you have commentary on the current state of our country, in particular, the MAGA war on Americans. And you wrote a book about American fascism, which I thought was so spot on. Can you introduce yourself and talk about your background and what you're focusing on these days?
So my name is Brynn Tannehill. I'm an author and essayist. I went to the United States Naval Academy and the Air Force Institute of Technology. My postgraduate work itself was in forecasting democratic decline, civil war, and genocide. Real fun stuff.
Wow. Yeah, that is fun stuff. Well, I'm a historian as well, and I wasn't in the military. I was born on an air base in the Philippines, so I kind of feel a little bit of that being part of a military family. So you've seen a lot of what goes into the falling apart of societies and how different countries get to points of crisis. And on this podcast, we've talked a lot about this war that MAGA they're waging on Americans. In fact, they're waging it on our kids and attacking their bodily autonomy, our bodily autonomy, the freedom of kids to be able to read books, to learn factual history, to get the medical treatment they want. And they've started this on the state level. Where do you think we are right now? And how do you put it all together?
So where I think we are we are in a really, really bad place. We are a country that is heavily fractionalized, most notably across lines of education, religion, and race, being the 3 big ones. And if you tell me those 3 things about a person, I can nail down with 90% certainty how they're voting, right?
Right.
Which is kind of terrifying. We have a country where the government is no longer responsive to the desires of the people. The elections really generally aren't capable of changing things very much because of the filibuster, because of the R+7 bias to the Senate, because of the R+4.5 bias to the Electoral College, to the fact that the Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative edge, even though virtually none of those judges were put in place by presidents who won the popular vote, right? The last 3 Supreme Court justices put on the court were put in place by somebody who didn't win the popular vote. And then you had the judges under Bush, Roberts and Alito, who Bush didn't win the popular vote the first time around. And we haven't had a Republican president win the popular vote once, right? In 2004, once in the last 30 years, right? So this is not a government that represents the people. And then you have gerrymandering, and based off the name of the podcast, I assume this has been discussed rather extensively, and we have North Carolina, their court flips, and all of a sudden voter suppression, racial and political gerrymandering is legal. We have one Democrat flip in North Carolina, and abortion's probably going to be illegal. Republicans went from talking about abortion being a states' rights issue to we're going to dictate this to everyone, everywhere in the United States, regardless of how they feel. You've got the fact that Montana and Wyoming have 1/67th the population of California, but have as much or more influence in the Senate than California does, right? This is radically disproportionate. This is representing the interests and values of a minority of Americans, and it's being pushed onto states and people that really, really don't want this, right? I mentioned religion, right? Do you know what the biggest religious group in America today are? People who are not religious. Now you have, essentially what amounts to white evangelical Protestants dictating terms to the largest religious group in America today, saying, guess what? You're going to be reciting the 10 Commandments, taking Bible studies in school in Texas, right? This is a last gasp of a shrinking culture to try and grab the country back through minoritarian rule. And if they just force their values on everyone and cut off sources of information, maybe they can make the country back into what they wish it was. And women are paying the price already. We see women that are suffering miscarriages or molar pregnancies being told, go bleed in your car in the parking lot for a while until you're nearly dead, then we can give you the abortion, right? Rather than providing a DNC immediately to save them. We're talking openly about eradicating transgenderism from public life, right? It's at a minimum, it's cultural genocide. But, if I was, if this was Germany in 1934 and Goebbels was saying, we must eradicate Judaism from public life, right? And people be, he just means we don't want to see any Jewish stuff in public. We don't want to get rid of that. That's probably a bad assumption to make if you're a decent human being. So we're talking about getting rid of entire segments of the population. And the most charitable interpretation of this is we are going to pass laws and create societal conditions where an entire group of people choose to either leave, flee, seek asylum, detransition, or go underground, right? And the methods they're using to do it do resemble 33 to 39 Germany in the sense that they're encouraging violence. They're cutting them off from access to serving in the government, to serving civil servants, to serving in the military, to participating in athletics, to being able to get an education, to getting professional certifications, to owning guns. We're seeing all of this. There's only a few ways we could go from here, and all of them are bad, right? The option of return to normalcy is a long shot.
And even normalcy isn't equal or really democratic as we like to think it was.
But my point is that was a government where there was still a give and take. There was still a cooperative form of government. There was still the, let's cut a deal, rather than two entrenched camps where we are literally less than a month away from the United States defaulting on its debt and casting us into an economic collapse that makes October 1929 look good.
Well, Even though our listeners have heard for the last several episodes us talking about all of this, it's as always, it's frightening and hard. So what do you think is the least bad possibility of how we move forward? Because the most bad possibility of where we move forward is worse than I think any American really thinks American can go.
So the least bad option is the Supreme Court takes an extreme states' rights position where every state gets to determine things on their own, no matter how good or bad they are, right? California, Washington, Oregon become their own little blue islands and protect their people and have something resembling civil rights. And then you have the vast center of the United States becoming deep red autocracies with no health care, no social safety net, no civil rights. Elections are a joke. Civil rights are a joke. Access to healthcare is a joke. We see plunging life expectancy that looks a lot like what we saw in Russia in the mid-90s, post-Soviet collapse, and that we're still tied together, that there's still a federal government to do the things like decide where we keep the nukes stationed, arbitrating between the states over things like water rights, having a common currency. But essentially, it's a de-evolution to a kind of a 1850s-ish kind of situation where there are very clear, there's slave states and then there's free states. And there's a lot of tension, but they're not going at each other like cats in a pillowcase yet, right? Maybe they're just keeping in two pillowcases, right? And that's kind of the best case scenario that's even vaguely plausible. I don't think it's that plausible because I think eventually we're going to start seeing cases brought before the Supreme Court that look a hell of a lot like Dred Scott. And we're going to start seeing stuff that starts looking like the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1852.
Can you remind our listeners what Dred Scott and the Fugitive Slave Act actually did?
Sure. So the Fugitive Slave Acts basically set in place something where blue states, if a slave fled to a free state, the blue states had to cooperate and give the slaves back, right, to the southern states. And Dred Scott basically ruled that black people were not Americans. They were not citizens. They were property, even if they did make it to a blue state, even if they were technically freemen. We saw slave hunting parties just grabbing free black people in the North and hauling them south for money. We saw the only safe place for black people in the United States was not to be in the United States. It was the end of the Underground Railroad was in Canada. People forget that. The Supreme Court in Dred Scott extended the power of the slave states all the way into blue states. And basically, with growing abolitionist sentiment, this was unacceptable. This wasn't a viable situation long term. We're coming to that in the United States where we're seeing an increased push to criminalize women who get abortions, to criminalize parents who provide healthcare for trans youth, to criminalize doctors, to eventually you're going to have a situation where the Supreme Court is going to have to, they're going to be Solomon. There's, you can't chop the baby in half. They're going to either have to decide, well, there's this woman and she fled South Carolina to a blue state and got an abortion. Now South Carolina is saying, bring her back, give her back. We need to execute her.
Right.
Or send her to prison for the rest of her natural life. And you have some place like New York or Massachusetts saying no. And the Supreme Court's going to do one of two things. They're either going to say, no, she is free to stay in this blue state where she will not be, executed, or you're going to have to hand her back. And the red states are going to find this intolerable if she gets to stay. And if the blue states are forced to hand over people for imprisonment and execution for seeking health care that's legal in their state or being trans or gay or whatever, they're going to eventually blue state populations are going to say, no, we're not doing this. No. And with the Supreme Court as weakened as it is institutionally and publicly via the series of scandals, via the fact that the justices were put in place by presidents who weren't elected by the popular vote, The fact that you've got, Supreme Court justices receiving tons of money from conservative sources, getting their debts paid off, hanging out with guys who are weird, creepy Nazi memorabilia collectors, right? Is the fact that Justice Roberts refuses to talk to Congress about setting up ethics rules for the Supreme Court. There's very much a let them eat cake sentiment coming from the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court's within a couple of years probably of issuing a ruling that leads either a blue state or a red state to say no. And the reason that these states are going to be willing to say no is because that if the Supreme Court has effectively delegitimized itself in the eyes of the public as an unethical, corrupt, unelected body put in place by presidents who didn't win the popular vote, right? Making decisions that the public is vehemently against and forcing them to accept something that they are completely unwilling to accept. For example, handing a woman back to a state for imprisonment or execution for getting an abortion, or sending trans people back to a state for prosecution, or doctors back to a state. There's a million different ways that red states and blue states are going to fight over the kids in some way. And like I said, eventually the Supreme Court's going to have to make a decision, and somebody's not going to like it and going to be disinclined to accept it. And that's probably going to break the 1850s-ish status quo that we're going to have for a very short period of time. And then after that, then it goes into, then we're in soft secession where you have states saying, we're going to take Supreme Court judgments as advisory in nature. We're still part of the U.S. We're just going to obey when we feel like it, right? That's kind of a soft secession scenario. Mm-hmm. The hard secession scenario is unthinkable, but it would be catastrophic. I mean, how do you decide water rights? How do you decide who gets nukes? How do you decide about the military? How do you decide about air traffic control of power, and et cetera, right. And currency and national debt and obligated? Boom, that's bad. So one thing to keep in mind too is that in a lot of these red states, if there was a theoretical national divorce, you would have these little tiny blue islands of urban right. centers like Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Houston, that are surrounded by deep red, that right. would be effectively disenfranchised and suppressed. And if they got their druthers with women and LGBT people and trans people in particular, that's going to cause some problems, because now you're going to generate refugees. So that's not particularly great either. So there's really no good options, right? And even if we did talk about the hard secession scenario, you've got Barbara Walter and Stephen Marsh, who wrote their books about Civil War. I talked about the urban-rural divide. Right. Well, in the deep blue areas like California, what are you going to do with, places like Shasta County that are up to their eyeballs in neo-fascist militias that right. don't want to be a part of the new California Republic or the Republic of Cascadia? Well, right. you're going to have what amounts to a simmering insurgency. It's bad.
Okay. Is there any way that you could see us deviating from any of these courses?
Well, yeah, there is the Hungarian and Russian option, which is to simply accept the authoritarianism and the loss of freedom and the loss of everything, and a government that is wholly unaccountable and can never be unelected, and that the opposition is token, and elections are essentially a public anesthetic, that we just sort of sink into this gray, hopeless malaise of wealth inequality, queer suppression, and state religion. And that's relatively peaceable. It's just not a place that would be good for LGBT people to live. It wouldn't be particularly great for disfavored minorities or people who are not particularly religious. Wouldn't be great for women of childbearing age.
Yeah. So it'd be good for the white, evangelical, straight, cis,
wealthy people. But, that's okay. It's good for the middle class-ish, right? Even if that middle class is shrinking, that middle class will still continue to vote for the people in charge. As long as you're middle class and you're not in one of those groups as being persecuted, life is pretty boring and normal. modern right-wing populist societies, particularly places like Hungary and Poland, you don't have secret police, you don't have Stasi, because the government knows that you can't beat them in the election and you can't overthrow them, that any complaining you do is just screaming into the void. Any protests are going to have zero effect, the way, Belarus was able to ride out the protests against their rigged elections. They'll make some noise and then they'll get bored and eventually they'll go home. Right. And that's it's actually the most efficient way to deal with being a competitive autocracy, is just you control everything, let them throw a tantrum, get upset, do whatever. Eventually they'll tire themselves out, get bored, go home, and things will go back to normal. And that is one of the biggest takeaways of what life in a post-democracy America would be like. For the vast majority of people who are kind of middle class-ish, life's boring and normal. It's not unless you're trans or Muslim or something, right? It means for your average kid in school, okay, yeah, we have to take Bible studies and recite the 10 Commandments, but really that's the only significant difference for most of them. And the fact that you can't pick your political leaders anymore.
My question would be, for the vast majority of straight, white, cis Christians, life is fairly normal. But there's an awful lot of us who aren't that, right? So I'm Jewish, and I can tell you that every Jewish family in this entire country has had the "when do we leave" conversation. I'm sure families of queer and trans people are having the "when do we leave" conversation. Women of childbearing age, I know, are having the "I can't get pregnant in this state" conversation.
But every trans family I know of has the conversation of not just when do we get out, but how do we get out? Right. And for many of them, there's the conclusion that we can't get out. Trans people don't have money. They don't have resources. We don't have anybody running an underground railroad to shuttle us to safe places. And there's too many of us to do it economically. The sad reality is I don't know what's going to happen to trans people that can't or won't leave, but I don't think it's going to be good. I know that every morning I wake up with stuff in my inbox from people saying, we're tapping out. We can't do it anymore. We're going to Spain, Ireland, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, or a blue state. People are leaving. We are entering a new phase, that this has just gotten simply too dangerous for a lot of trans people. And for trans people who are in a decent situation, I know myself, I've mapped out all the different contingencies. There is literally a spreadsheet with contingencies that identifies, okay, this is where we make the decision to get out, and this is how quickly we have to get out, right? They revoke our passports and tell us we can have them back when we detransition. Okay, that's the show up at the Canadian embassy and request asylum contingency. I go to the Canadian embassy. I send the kids and my Canadian wife to Canada while they can, and hope that we're reunited under a refugee or asylum seeker process. Right? That's why? Because we've seen that exact move before in November of 1938. It's the signal that they no longer wish for you to flee. That's the signal that they would prefer you don't flee.
Is there anything that you can see that might give people hope, or should we all just really start making plans for saving our families and calling it lost? So
the thing that's saving us right now is the fact that the Republican Party doesn't control the entirety of the media yet, that there are still free-ish outlets, even if CNN is behaving stupidly.
And CBS too, don't forget them.
And the New York Times when it comes to trans issues. But the Republican Party is, to most people right now, appears a little bug nuts crazy. They don't appear focused on issues that matter to normal people. There's some recent polling from YouGov that showed that things that while trans people is a tiny issue to the GOP base, it's the thing that they most want to see their candidates go after, just because they like the cruelty is the point. They want culture warriors, and they want somebody who's going to get in there and wreak unholy vengeance on the people they see as their societal enemies. How a Republican nominee in 2024 is going to reconcile the base's need for unholy culture war against this tiny little group of people as one of the primary issues that they want to hear about, versus talking about stuff that might appeal to the few, 5% ish of voters who might swing one way or another. Those voters are probably not likely to be all that swayed by culture war on trans people stuff, woke mind virus, all that.
Yeah.
The really nutso stuff, right? They're probably going to be swayed a lot more by pocketbook kinds of issues. So it's possible we could get another 4 more years of a Democrat in the White House, and at which, over time, as the Republican Party continues to just be all in on culture war. You talked about your kid, right? How old is he?
15.
15? Give him another 6 years. He and his entire cohort are going to be voting, right?
That's right. They're all going to be voting. Right.
They're going to be voting in the 2028 election, right? Considering that the average life expectancy in the United States is dropping, a lot of the people that would be voting for Trump are not going to be with us anymore in 2028. We're seeing a demographic shift in voting patterns that millennials and Gen Z are not getting more conservative as they get older. They're getting more liberal, right? That the Republicans are talking about Gen Z as the enemy. But this
is why I think that the war is on kids right now, right? I mean, because none of them are going to vote for these wackadoodle people.
So I think that the hope is that we hang on by our fingernails. Now, the problem is that it's going to be tough for Democrats to hang on to the Senate in 2024,
right?
Which I know that no matter how many vacant seats there are on the Supreme Court, McConnell will hold them open. So that creates all kinds of problems, because we can't really get effective change without some sort of shift on the Supreme Court. So, I mean, the best hope is that 8-10 years down the line, the Republican Party continues to be bug nuts crazy, that Gen Z continues to grow as a share of the voting population, that maybe we hang on by their fingernails and don't end up with more crazy Supreme Court justices. It's going to be rough. It's going to be ugly. There's going to be a mass migration of queer people, regardless. But maybe we can have something starting to come closer to normalcy by 2032. If the Republican Party has an implosion that looks like the Whigs in the 1850s, maybe. You notice there's a lot of ifs in there.
Right.
There isn't a clear path. There isn't something that you can do a lot to influence. It all requires a confluence of events to get us back to something not horrible. So, I'm accused of being a doomsayer, and you know what I am. But my position isn't that we're completely doomed. There's no hope. It's we're probably screwed, but maybe we can pull it out. We're not there yet, but we're getting close.
That's dark. Is there anything that you can think of that people can do to influence the outcome, whether it's at local levels, state levels, or national?
So start by reclaiming offices, elected offices at the local level. Encourage Gen Z to get involved. Encourage your kids to vote. Encourage their friends to vote. That their votes, they need to vote now while their votes still matter. Because if we keep going the direction we're going in another 4 to 8 years, their votes won't matter anymore. And that's where we don't want to be. That's what we're trying to avoid. Being smart consumers of information, speaking up for marginalized populations, to help pull people back who are ignorant, not evil. These are all the kinds of things that can be done starting now. But from an electoral standpoint, the key to this entire equation is shifting Gen Z voting patterns to get them out to vote. They already vote one way. They just don't vote in big enough numbers. And that's the key thing we have to do.
So you're telling me it's a little bit Whitney Houston and the children are our future.
Yes. Oh, God.
I had to bring a little bit of levity to this, but I can go to the dark place too. Although for me and for the people I've had on, the only way we manage to keep ourselves sane enough to keep going is to compartmentalize enough to be activists, to be working towards something that may or may not ever happen. So for me, I live in Massachusetts. I work on Indiana and red state politics because I would go into a death spiral of despair if I didn't, which I know a lot of people are in. I think I would recommend to our listeners that if this conversation scared the crap out of you, then the way to help is to actually get out there and help and be working on talking to our kids and making sure that they're involved and educated and getting them out to vote.
And the positive sign is, there was a graduation the other day, right? And several of the kids showed up opened their gowns to show T-shirts with messages for the governor standing right next to them, right? We're seeing pretty good sized protests from the LGBT community and from LGBT kids. Gen Z does feel this, considering that I think now that like 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBT, primarily bi, but somewhere within the spectrum.
The latest I heard was actually 25.
Is it 25? Okay. So you have this entire built-in group right now who, and young women too are threatened by all of this, right? And this is just a built-in political activist base, and it just needs to be activated. It needs to be, I hate to use the word leveraged, but given the opportunity to vote and fought for and have their voting rights ensured, because this is where the votes to change things and bail us out are going to come from. And we just have to make sure that they vote while their votes still count for something. And it's not an entirely hopeless situation, but it's not great either. And that's what I really want to impress upon people is, for most of your listeners, I'm going to say that, yeah, okay, if we fall into competitive autocracy and single party rule, life is going to be boring and normal, and elections are going to be meaningless exercises for most of you, unless you happen to be, somebody very specifically affected. But you don't want to live like that. I don't want to live like that. And then for people like me who are going to have to pull the ejection seat handle and get out, well, that's the end of my life in the United States. It's the end of my life, or the life for my wife, for my kids. We're done. We have to bail out for Halifax or, Quebec, right? That's not the way things should be. That's going back to the 1850s where the only safe place for certain people was all the way at the end of the line in Canada.
Right. But the difference between now and the 1850s is that we have nuclear weapons.
Which is a whole nother ball of wax, which the part of this where people ask me what's going to happen, and I don't know, because never in human history have we seen this.
Right.
The United States has 400 plus million firearms and only 330 million people.
Yeah.
And the number of firearms is increasing much faster than the number of people. And I've never seen what happens when a country comes apart, when you have this ratio of guns to people. No one in human history has. So ask me, well, how, with all these guns and with all these people, what's going to happen? And the answer is, I have no idea. This is, as a historian, you would say there's no historical analog. As a statistician, I would say, when you take a regression plot and you put a point that's completely off all the other data points, it's, your cluster of data points is here. And now you have to predict what happens at a point all the way out here. You can't use the historical data for that. It's a bad idea. You're going to, that's one of the things that kind of scares me But I also, will admit freely that I have no idea what's going to happen. Maybe nothing, maybe insurgency. I don't know.
Well, on that note, I'm going to thank you for coming on, and thank you also for going with me to a place where there's a possibility that we could make things a little bit better while unfairly leaning on our children and their peers.
Well, we're Gen X. We've known from the beginning that there's not enough of us to do much of anything.
That's true. Yeah. Whenever I see the articles, it says Gen X is screwing up everything because they're the Trumpists. I'm like, a little. We don't have the power to screw anything up.
That's kind of like punching out the guy in the clown suit at McDonald's because your hamburger sucked.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. Exactly. So thanks for coming on. Even though, I'm sure talking about it makes you feel worse. I think people need to wake up, and having someone help to wake them up is really important. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's kind of my second job.
Thanks for listening to What the Gerrymander. We're working toward building Blue Indiana and ask that you make a small recurring donation at HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcast. We thank you, and democracy thanks you.